the Cholas. You're writing this book at a time when they are sexy again. I don't know if they were ever sexy, but we are very interested in the Cholas today. Primarily because we as a nation want to look back, find someone in our history that's not British or Mughal.
I had this idea that the Cholas are these great conquerors, and then to see a Deccan perspective on them where they appear as outsiders was very surprising, because from the Deccan perspective, here you have the Deccanese talking about how the Cholas are destroying temples. They're talking about the Chola army committing all kinds of atrocities.
So there's the right wing, then there's the left, but there is this, bona fide academic person who studied history that may tend to look down at you and say that what is this public historian? What is this pop historian?
Increasingly, I found that academic historians are as diverse as any group of people. There are going to be the snooty, oh, you didn't study under XYZ, you didn't have this fellowship, you didn't go to this college, so you're not really welcome here. But there'll also be the folks who are like, wow, thank you for writing about my work.
The most exciting thing about Cholas, and that's why we are so interested in them today, is the military might. But you kind of completely upturn that. You're suggesting that it's actually through the ingenuity of the Tamil merchants, because of which Cholas were able to expand, conquer.
We need to think about medieval states on the basis of what medieval evidence tells us rather than what nationalist pandering and yearning in the 21st century tells us.
What was the life of a Dalit like under a Chola king?
So,
did they practice untouchability?
There's inscriptional proof.
So when these assemblies were congregating, would they have representation of Dalits, or that would not happen?
Medieval kings, as I said again and again, didn't have that kind of power. Instead, what you see is something very similar to contemporary India, where it's the middle castes who are most responsible for the function in the caste system, and they are not only trying to seize a position under the topmost in the hierarchy, they're also pushing down against those below.
Welcome to Newslaundry interview. Today we have someone very special with us, Anirudh Kanisetti, who's out with a new book on the Chola Empire. It's called Lord of the Earth and Sea. I'm halfway through it.
Thank you.
It's very pacey. And I really want to talk to you about your writing style and why you've chosen to write the way you have. And I'll get to that in a bit, but let's begin first with the Cholas. And Cholas as Shaivites, Hindus as we define them today, the OG colonizers present themselves as a really nice, brand ambassador for Indians back in medieval India who weren't afraid of the world, who were taking on the world. So there's a sense of pride that we derive out of this particular empire. Is that the reason why you chose to delve deeply into this empire for your second book?
This kind of opened my eyes to the fact that, look, medieval people didn't see their world with the same rosy eyes that we tend to today. We want to see the medieval world as this ideal place because it suits the dominant political agenda.
The most important thing for the king was to convince the masses that he's capable of being their king. And the two ways in which he'd do that is express devotion, that means temples, building temples, having an ecosystem around temples, and then conquests. But when you talk about village administration, like villagers deciding that they own this piece of land and they're going to discuss agricultural practices on it or irrigational practices on it, how much of a direct kind of say did the king have at local governance level?
Well, actually not that much. And it's you will very often see that village assemblies, when they're taking a decision, to be like, oh, it is year 5 of the glorious king XYZ. And then they will just move on to talking about their own business.
So
and then
they will lip service that he exists,
it's very
and thank you to him. But
exactly. So it's kind of formulaic. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? If an urgent decision has to be taken about rebuilding a bund or expanding cultivation, you are not going to wait for weeks and weeks to get permission from some distant royal center to do this. And we don't have any evidence that medieval states maintained district level offices.
Let's come to religion, because that's also quite a contested thing with Cholas. First, I want to understand, what was their Shaivites? They invest in temples dedicated to Shiva, but they also donate to Vaishnav temples, to Jains, to Buddhists. And at that point, I'm guessing they weren't really in friendly terms.
You do see some cases where in the Rajarajeshwaram temple, the Brihadishwara temple at Tanjore, there are some mentions of lands being appropriated from Jain and Vaishnava temples to be given to this one.
Okay.
But at the same time, you have Rajaraja Chola's sister Kundavai building Jain temples in a frontier of the kingdom. So I think that there was no singular consistent religious policy. A lot of what was being done was mostly on an ad hoc basis, responding to local political needs. And I think that has been generally the case with all Indian polities, how they dealt with religion. Now, specifically with the Cholas, you do have some claims of violence between Shaivites and Vaishnavites, especially in the later part of the period when they become very, very powerful factions with large followings. So you have a very interesting case in Thirumayam, which is in present-day Pudukkottai, so it's a bit south of the Kaveri area, where in the 13th century, the Shaivites and the Vaishnavites had such a terrible argument and it devolved into fighting.
There's so much politics around Cholas and whether they were Hindus or not. So Kamal Hassan jumps in and says, no, you're trying to erase Dravidian identity. Mani Ratnam's movie should not have shown them as Hindus. You have BJP jump in and say that, no, you're trying to erase Hindu icons and we will reclaim our icons. What do you think of this, kind of political narrative?
I think it's kind of self-defeating. This inability to think of medieval people with nuance, to think of them as people, but rather we are constantly inflicting this profound violence on them by insisting that they should fit only to our modern political
agendas.
Yeah? It is such a reductive way of thinking about the past. And it's very ironic to me as a public historian, this is happening most often from the people who claim to be restoring some idea of historical pride. I don't think that historical pride should simply mine the entire past for feel-good points in a very brief political context. I think if you want to have historical pride, the least you can do is respect your ancestors as people, respect the world they lived in as complex, and accept that it is not going to fit into our boundaries.
Tell us about this world of the Tamil merchant that, firstly they were guilds, right? It was almost like a corporation. They came together as a corporation. They had immense influence over Southeast Asia as far as China. And they are the primary reason why the Cholas were able to kind of go and conquer up till Sumatra or Sri Lanka.
There is actually no evidence of a Chola state overseas. There's no inscriptions of the Cholas overseas. There's no mentions of Chola princes being stationed overseas. And there's no evidence of Chola commissioned temples overseas. But there is evidence of Tamil merchant settlements that have been discovered on the coast of northern Sumatra. There is evidence of inscriptions made by these Tamil merchants where they don't mention the Chola kings at all. And we also have temples built by these merchants in their settlements. So what is the evidence telling us? The evidence is telling us that this overseas footprint is primarily because of this remarkably independent and outward-looking diaspora.
I don't think, pre-2014 or 2012 even, young people were discussing histories or history was a drawing room conversation, right? Today it's a primetime news conversation. I think news anchors talk more about Mughals and Cholas and, what happened to the temples in the south versus what happened to the temples in the north than current news events. So it's hotly debated. So what is it like is it an exciting time to be a public historian?
I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head. It is a very exciting time to be writing about history because people are going to read it. But at the same time, it's also a bit frightening because people are going to read it and people are going to get very worked up about it because that is the terms on which political discourse has been set. Rather than having a reasonable fact-based discussion about contemporary political events over which we do have control, the focus instead has become this high-pitched hysteria almost. And this increasing politicization of history, that history tells us what we should be doing today, history tells us who we should be angry at today, and also those who don't agree with us are enemies and their narrative must be stamped out.
Now that we expanded our conversation to medieval kings, what's the one misconception that you'd like to clear?
I think the most important thing to clear up is that medieval kings were not absolute rulers. A lot of what they did was dictated by local political needs. And so a lot of what they said was intended for medieval local audiences that we have no or very little insight into. So when we're reading medieval sources, when we're reading the grandiose claims of these figures, we should take them with a heaping fistful of salt. Because power is capable of telling stories about itself. People are capable of telling stories about themselves. We see that happening with political power today.
Free में इतना ही मिलेगा. To watch the full unedited interview, you have to subscribe to Newslaundry and pay to keep news free. Because we don't run advertising. All our money comes from subscribers like you. And that is how public service journalism is paid for. All the studio lights, the cameras, all that you see on our website, it all comes from subscribers. So do subscribe, click on the subscription link, watch all the interviews unedited, and pay for public interest journalism.